At 1 o'clock in the morning on June 27, 1898, in the harbour of Newport, Rhode Island, a small boat moved almost silently through the dark water. The world was uneasy. America was already at war with Spain. Newspapers were writing about warships, the Caribbean, and the rise of a new American power. Harbours were full of rumours. Some people looked toward the horizon and expected enemy vessels. Others believed they were living at the beginning of a new age, an age in which metal and steam would decide the future of the oceans. But at that hour, no warship came toward the shore. No fleet arrived. No expedition appeared with officers, doctors, mechanics, and scientists. Instead, an old wooden boat arrived, a little more than 11 meters long. Her name was Spray. She had once been an oyster boat. At one time, she had been abandoned, rotten, and left in a field in Massachusetts, as if she belonged to the rubbish heap, not to the sea. And the strangest thing was this: there was only one man on her deck. He was 54 years old. His name was Joshua Slocum. His face carried the marks of salt, wind, and years. His body carried the tiredness of 3 oceans. His hands knew the ropes as if they were part of him. By that moment, he had already done something that no one in recorded history had clearly proven before him. But his story does not begin here, and it does not begin with victory. At the end of the 19th century, the sea was changing. The sailing world, where a captain carried all the power and all the responsibility on his ship, was giving way to steam, steel, and huge machines. Great sailing ships still cut through the oceans with their canvas, but their time was already running out. Ships that had once carried pride, cargo, and human destinies across the world were now often sold, turned into simple cargo vessels, or simply abandoned. Joshua was born on February 20th, 1844, in Nova Scotia, in the hard sea world of Atlantic Canada. It was a place where land and ocean met. The Bay of Fundy was not an ordinary place. There, the tides rose and fell with enormous force. There, boys learned early that water could feed you, but it could also take everything from you. Slocum came from a family connected to the sea. His father worked on the land, but there were sailors in the family, men who looked at the horizon not as a border, but as a road. His childhood was not a sea adventure story. He was the 5th of 11 children in a Quaker farming family. From the loft of his father's barn, he could see the masts of trading ships moving through the bay below. He read whenever he could hide away with a book, but his father, a harsh man who made shoes when he was not breaking the will of his sons, beat him for it. At the age of 10, Joshua was already working in the family shoe shop. His formal education ended early. His mother died while he was still young. At 14, he ran away to sea. His father brought him back. At 16, he ran away again, this time forever, and signed on as a cabin boy on an ocean sailing ship. For many years, he would not see Nova Scotia again. But the sea did not promise happiness. It promised work, danger, and only sometimes bread. Slocum rose step by step. He became a sailor, then a navigator, then a captain. He sailed to China, Australia, Japan, the Spice Islands, today's Indonesia, and South America. For decades, he lived in a world that, for most people, was only empty space on a map. But for him, those spaces were routes, winds, currents, and dangerous shallows. By the 1880s, he was at his peak. One of the ships he was proud of was the Northern Light, a large sailing vessel he later described as one of the finest American sailing ships of her time. Later, he owned the Aquidneck, a ship that seemed almost perfect to him, but the economy was changing. Steamships were appearing everywhere. They were faster, cheaper, and more reliable. The great sailing fleets that had carried world trade for 3 centuries were beginning to vanish from the trade routes. Slocum hated steam. He called the new ships dirty, smelly vessels, and he watched his own profession fall apart before his eyes. In South America, Slocum suffered a personal disaster. His first wife, Virginia, died in Argentina in 1884. He was 40 years old. He had 4 surviving children, a ship, and no clear idea how to go on. Still, he continued. He left his younger children with his sisters in Boston, kept his oldest son Victor as first mate, and tried to begin again. He married Henrietta, a young cousin who came aboard the Aquidneck, and very quickly understood that she did not want a life at sea. Within 1 year, they lived through a hurricane, diseases, and a pirate attack. At the end of 1887, the Aquidneck ran aground near Brazil. He lost her too. Without insurance, the loss was devastating. With his family, he built a small boat from local materials, named it Liberdade, and sailed it back toward North America. When Henrietta stepped ashore in Boston, she never went to sea with her husband again. By the spring of 1892, Slocum was 48 years old, broke, professionally unwanted, and living apart from his second wife. It seemed as if he had almost nothing left to live for, and no clear path forward. Then an old acquaintance, Captain Eben Pierce of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, offered him an abandoned oyster sloop that was lying in a pasture in Fairhaven. She was in terrible condition. Her hull was rotten. But when Slocum saw her, something moved inside him. It was as if life in him wanted to return. He decided to rebuild her, piece by piece. For 13 months, he worked alone. He cut timber. He set the keel. He rebuilt the hull. He thought about strength, not luxury. And in that boat, he recognized something that looked like himself, something thrown away by time, but not yet dead. When Spray was finally ready, she was 36 feet and 9 inches long, a little more than 11 meters. She was more than 4 meters wide. She was a space for living, working, resting, and surviving. Picture a wooden boat shorter than a bus, placed not in calm water, but in the largest and deepest oceans on Earth. After finishing her, Slocum told a journalist that he planned to sail around the world alone in her. People thought he was joking, but it was not a joke. On April 24, 1895, Slocum sailed from Boston. The wind was favorable. Spray left the harbor. There was no ceremony. There was no government money. He did not leave as the representative of a nation. He left as a man who had made an agreement with himself, and he had promised to return. The first days were not heroic. 5 days after sailing from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the open North Atlantic gave him his first real test. The wind grew stronger all afternoon, and by evening, Spray was racing over the waves before a furious storm. Slocum reduced the sails, tied himself to the cabin roof, and spent the night holding on. The boat behaved better than he had any right to expect. Her wide hull and heavy keel kept her steady where a more delicate boat might have turned sideways to the waves. By morning, the wind was weakening. Slocum had survived his first ocean storm alone. He did not have a real marine chronometer, the kind normally used for accurate navigation at that time. Modern sailors were already depending on precise instruments, but Slocum sailed with only a cheap tin clock. Still, he was an old-school sailor who understood currents and the sky. He could use the moon and the stars to estimate his position. He crossed the Atlantic to the Azores and continued toward Gibraltar. The British Admiralty warned him that pirates from the Barbary coast were active near Morocco and might chase a small boat for ransom. Slocum laughed and continued. 3 days later, a small pirate sailing vessel approached quickly from the south, its sails dark in the haze. The pirates were closing the distance when a sudden storm struck both vessels. The pirate boat, larger and heavier, lost its mast. Spray, low and stable, escaped through the storm. Slocum described the moment calmly, as if the wind had simply favored the man who was prepared. After crossing the Atlantic toward Brazil, he turned south toward the Strait of Magellan. The Strait of Magellan is not just a waterway. It is a maze between South America and Tierra del Fuego, a place of sudden winds, narrow channels, cold, currents, rain, fog, and rocks. There, the world feels harsh and hostile. For one man in a small boat, it was a test that could end in silence, with no one ever knowing what had happened. He arrived in February 1896 and spent the next 2 months trying to pass through it. Storms drove him back. Ice formed on the ropes and rigging. Twice, the wind pushed him out of the strait and forced him to begin again. On April 13th, 1896, he came out of the strait. Then the Pacific Ocean opened before him. For 72 days, he saw no land and no other ship. Think of more than 2 months with no land and no human voice except your own. Food was only what he had brought with him and what the sea sometimes threw onto the deck. Sleep came in short pieces, never fully peaceful. The stars were not only beautiful lights above him, they were his guide. Rain was not just bad weather, it was fresh, drinking water. Amazingly, Spray could sail herself. She seemed almost like a living being, a companion to her captain. The boat was so well balanced that Slocum could tie the helm and go below to read or cook. She held her course for thousands of miles. The man who loved the sea and loved his boat had given everything he had to build her. In a way, he had created something close to perfection, something that is still difficult to explain today. At some point, even the silence began to work on him. By the 3rd week, he was speaking out loud to the boat, to the wind, and to the empty deck behind him. He gave commands to Spray as if she could answer. He read passages from Cervantes and Mark Twain aloud. A man alone at sea must speak, even if he speaks to nothing. Slocum did not call it loneliness. He called it the price of sailing. On July 16, 1896, he reached Samoa, the place where the famous Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson had spent his final days. Stevenson's widow, Fanny, met Slocum in the harbour and gave him 4 volumes from her late husband's library. She had read about Slocum in the newspapers and wanted him to have books to carry with him across the Indian Ocean. From that point on, in more and more ports, his story arrived before he did. People had heard about the lonely sailor with the small sailing boat, but many still could not believe that one man had really crossed an ocean alone. In several ports, officials came aboard to see for themselves. They walked from one end of Spray to the other, looking for a hidden crew member. One customs officer in Mauritius asked him 3 times where the other men slept. Slocum simply opened the small cabin and showed him the only bed, the books, and the cracked tin clock. After Samoa, he continued to Fiji, Australia, and Tasmania. In Australia, the news of his voyage had already arrived before him. He was no longer just a strange captain with a small boat. He was an event. People came to see Spray. They invited him in. They questioned him. He gave lectures in every major port. Crowds came. Newspapers wrote about him. The man who had left Boston with $1.50 arrived in Cape Town as a public figure. At the beginning of his voyage, Slocum was almost useless to the modern world. By the time he reached Australia, he had become a symbol. From Australia, Slocum continued toward the Torres Strait and the Indian Ocean. In the warm seas, there were coral reefs, shallows, currents, and sudden changes in the wind. A lone sailor had to be observer, cook, carpenter, and navigator at the same time. Tiredness also began to build. In May 1898, he learned that the world he was returning to was at war. The Spanish-American War had already begun. Near the equator, he met the American battleship Oregon, which was searching for Spanish warships. The 2 vessels exchanged signals. Spray was not a threat. After that meeting, Slocum had no other ocean ahead of him. Only the final and most deceptive distance remained. The final approach to North America was cruel. Instead of a gentle return, Slocum met calm winds, then rough water, and finally, a tornado near Fire Island, close to New York. On June 27, 1898, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Spray dropped anchor in Newport. Think of 46,000 miles and periods of sailing that lasted for months without a safe harbour in which to anchor. A straight line around the equator is about 24,855 miles. Slocum's route was not a second circumnavigation, but its distance was almost twice that number because the path around the world was long, uneven, and full of detours. He had spent more than a year building this boat. The materials had cost a little more than $500, but the deeper truth was this: his skills still mattered, and he had built the proof. The voyage lasted 3 years, 2 months, and 2 days. Slocum had sailed around the world alone. 2 years later, his book Sailing Alone Around the World was published. It was an immediate success. The English poet and journalist Sir Edwin Arnold wrote in his review, "I do not hesitate to call it the most extraordinary book ever published." The book became a classic. Slocum earned money and bought a farm on Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. For a moment, it seemed that the old sailor had found his place on land, but only for a moment. After about 10 years, the silence of the farm began to make him feel that life was slowly moving away from him. By 1909, he was 65 years old and started planning a new voyage: South America, the Orinoco River, the Amazon. He told friends that he wanted to write another book. On November 14, 1909, he sailed from Vineyard Haven aboard Spray. The weather was clear. The wind was favorable. A few dock workers on the pier saw him untie the lines. After that, no one ever saw him or Spray again. No wreckage was found. No body was found. The first person to sail alone around the world in a sailing boat left no final words. The book about South America was never begun. Spray was never found. But the voyage remains. 46,000 miles, 3 years. One man, one boat. After that, every solo sailor who crossed an ocean, whether they knew it or not, measured themselves against the line that Joshua Slocum had drawn alone across the map.